Okay, so this is our last panel, last but not least. We're going to talk about outer space today. And really the purpose of this panel is to highlight how space is actually shaping our society, our everyday life, and shapes actually the ecosystem in which humanity lives. And we really want to put that at the forefront of our conversation today. So it's really important that we see outer space not only as a wonder for physics, for biology, but also as a crucial and fundamental parts of all of the environmental solutions that we're trying to get at. A fundamental actor in conflict zones, in our organization of our services, and spaces really touches all of the spheres of social science. So today we're really excited as to how we can develop a more secure way to harness outer space as a way to develop our species for the better, because of the very high developments that we're getting in the sphere. And by the end of our discussion, we really want to have engendered in you a thinking, some thoughts on how we can all be together in getting outer space at the forefront of our everyday life. In order to make that magic happen, we have a wonderful panel here, and we're just going to start with a short introduction. So my name is Mélusine Lebré. I am a master's student in conflict studies at the LSE. And over to you, Ali.
Thank you. So I'm Ali Stickings. I'm the business manager for Defence Space at Frazer-Nash Consultancy. It's a systems engineering and technology company. So I'm responsible for strategy, business development, and client relationships across space within the military, industry, and government. My background and interests cover UK space policy, military space programs, space warfare, counter-space capabilities, space situational awareness, arms control and disarmament, and the intersection of space and missile defense.
Hi everyone, Manish Shah. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm the Managing Director for OrbitFab UK and Europe, which is an in-space refueling company. And I joined a few months ago. Before that, I was in Bryce-Tech, a consulting company, and have background in SATCOMs.
I'm Michelle Howard. I'm a government strategic policy advisor, mostly for the defence and space sectors. So, and I'm also a part-time PhD student at King's in defence studies. And I am engaged in a number of activities to sort of advocate for the space sector and hopefully get the government to support policies which help these guys thrive here in the UK.
I'm Mark Stokes, CEO and co-founder of MagDrive. Super excited to be here at Future Impact Summit. We're developing extremely high-power electric plasma thrusters for satellites and spacecraft, for avoidance maneuvers and entirely new business models and opportunities in space. I lead on the company's strategy, finance, operations, pretty much everything that's not technical, actually. I stopped doing that about a year and a half ago. I'm particularly interested in space governance and environmental issues and working with other companies such as OrbitFab on the environmental and manufacturing issues that allow us to have a better world here, but also out in space as well.
So as you can see, we have a very amazing panel from very different sort of niche in space. So without further ado, I just wanted to open the discussion with a question for all of you, and also to catch the audience into the debate. So just as a whole, which areas of our life are likely to be impacted the most by the development in the space sector and all of the related technologies in the near future?
Well, I can give you a quick overarching answer, and then I'll let the experts give you more detail. But essentially, space is the great hidden enabler of almost everything we do. It's for critical infrastructure, so all of our transport, our financial transactions, maritime logistics, all of that's reliant on space-based technologies. All of the mobile phone technology that you're using to kind of pass the time while we waffle on about space, that's also down to space-based technologies as well. And in fact, London Economics a couple of years ago carried out a quite comprehensive study on the impact on our loss of GNSS, so the kind of sat navigation capabilities. And they, on the UK alone, that would be about £1 billion a day, they calculated. Everyone will roll their eyes here because we always use this statistic, but I think it's quite impactful, and it really gives you the idea of how much we rely on space in our daily lives.
I think I'd agree with that, and there's actually really hard to find a part of our life that isn't actually impacted by space at the moment. But I think, and I know it's something we're going to come on to again, is particularly around climate. I think the ability of space to help us understand what's happening in climate, so particularly through Earth observation, but other areas that space is being looked at, for example, with space-based solar power, and actually having very long structures in space that will collect solar power, which will then be beamed back down to Earth. My company's been involved in a lot of this work, quite a few studies that this could actually be a valid contribution to achieving net zero. So I think we're sort of start looking at some of those bigger, I guess, societal questions, where I think we're going to see more of the impact rather than personal life, where it's already there.
Yeah, and the next phase really is, in the enabling sense, the next phase really is coming from the fact that we can manufacture in space now. And we're talking about having this 3-kilometer long solar array in space, which is going to beam power back down to Earth. That's only possible because we can both simulate, model what that kind of structure would look like, but we can actually build it because launch costs have come down far enough, because there is an understanding of how space is a critical piece of infrastructure. But it goes beyond just that. If you can have stations in space which can manufacture at that capacity, it means they can also manufacture improved goods and services to be used back down on Earth. And we're looking particularly at medicine, we're looking at fiber optic cables such as ZBLAN, which represent a magnitude improvement in silicon chips, in how we think about telecommunications in the first place. Going beyond that, it means coming back around to the climate question in a very real way and moving manufacturing off Earth. The question, for example, of being able to mine asteroids instead of mining the Earth is no longer a subset of science fiction. It's being looked at very seriously by very serious organizations who are putting a huge amount of money there, both in the public sector and the private sector. Sure, they see it from the point of view of making a massive financial return. They're not doing this altruistically, but you find people within these organizations who look at it very much through the lens of an environmental point of view. And that's not something that's going to go away anytime soon either.
I think just to extend on some of the points already made, there were some stats in the US, for example, where space technologies are key to, I think, $10+ trillion of the US economy. So that just gives you an example of how impactful space is in terms of the technology today, in terms of not necessarily in the future, but right now, how key it is to our everyday lives. And in terms of monitoring climate change, space technologies are key to most methods of climate monitoring and the variables that are used to monitor climate change. And beyond that, we talk about kind of sustainability on Earth. I think the important thing to also consider is sustainability in space, because the approach that we currently take, where we launch satellites and then we ditch them in space when they run out of fuel, is very unsustainable. So I just wanted to put a plug in there for my company.
It brings us nicely to OrbitFab's mission.
Which is what OrbitFab is doing.
Bit of advertising here, man. So it's everything that you've been saying touches upon all of the sectors and areas of our life, and it represents all of the opportunities that we have, that we are creating for ourselves today, and that is going to be developed in the near future. And so, I mean, everything, all of this is going to be developed through business and through there is a new space economy that is emerging and that is enabling all of these changes to happen. So turning to you, Mark and Manny, we were all wondering how we can enable more companies such as the ones that where you work, like companies and startups, to innovate in the space sector and drive further evolution in the new space economy and in the economy as a whole.
There's the kind of blunt answer, which is that it needs financing, which comes in the form of non-dilutive grants. The UK is a pretty mixed landscape for that. It can be very hard to acquire it, but it can, the UK Space Agency will say it can't be lobbied, but it clearly can. Apologies if there's anybody here from the agency today, but it can be, and it can be a frustrating process for a small startup because a lot of the time you can't rely on this type of funding to be a continuous cash flow for you, and it's hard to scale up. It inevitably pushes you towards venture capital. In the UK, venture capital doesn't have the kind of entrepreneurial background that you'd find in the US. Overwhelmingly, I can't remember the numbers now, but it's a shocking statistic. Like 1% of all UK VC funds have an entrepreneur in their partners, in the people who make decisions. Whereas in the US, it's like 70%. And what the lockdown pandemic really did is it created a global marketplace for venture capital. So instead of just having to go and talk to UK and European VCs, MagDrive, for example, we spoke to American VCs almost exclusively. UK VCs can't really be incentivized any further to have better valuations for small companies, to have someone they can do due diligence with on a more space-based angle. And it's an excellent opportunity for all the many different players in the UK government space area, so the Satellite Applications Catapult, the Space Agency, DSTL, to take a more active role in that financing element, which can be done through procurement of a system, acting a little bit like the US government does. And we're starting to see that come in, and that takes the form not just of financing, but also where you find people for your team and expertise, but also access to facilities as well. So the Satellite Applications Catapult has filled that role particularly well in terms of just clean room access. It's almost impossible to find access to a clean room you can just rent in this country. It's almost impossible. You have to buy it or build it yourself. And for a small startup, particularly one like MagDrive that has to build hardware, like we're putting our first flight up in December, we wouldn't be able to do it otherwise. And it's an absolutely key part of that. So the funding that goes into those facilities is really key, and having enough of them that they get spread around everywhere. Because any startup that looks at its future journey is going to identify all the facilities it needs, and if it sees that it can't access them, is going to run into a stumbling block very early on and will immediately have to look at either trying an entirely different idea, an easier idea, one that has less of an impact overall, or just going to another country. And that defeats the entire purpose. So the facilities angle is also a really important part, and we're getting a lot better at it.
Yeah, and kind of in terms of what investors generally want to see is what is the traction that the company has had, be that in terms of customers, in terms of technology. When it comes to customers, the US is really good at being a customer of different products and capabilities. We see that ourselves. So my company is a US headquartered company. We've won a number of contracts from the US DoD, including a recent fuel cell agreement for close to $15 million. So although obviously the US is a much bigger market, those kinds of contracts really powerful for attracting funding from investors who see actually you've got a government customer that adds substantial credibility to your business, and then over time that helps you to get through that valley of death in order to then also be able to attract more customers from a range of segments. So having government as a customer, I think, is a crucial strand of how to spur innovation in the UK. And I feel like we are getting some signals of that being the direction of travel in the UK, but we'll see how much of it turns into reality.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that the customer question is absolutely key for this. And I think, government need to have a very clear government line on where its support is going to come from, and into what specific areas as well. I think particularly the UK is small in terms of space, and we can't do everything. So I think a very clear route in terms of the specific capabilities, specific technologies that the UK government is interested in, and how that will affect the industrial landscape. And I think there are still a lot of areas where the potential customers are not actually aware of what space can do for them. So if we look at Earth observation, more and more companies are, sending satellites up and going, look, we can give you these great images. But the customers aren't necessarily aware of how that can help them. So you look at global supply chains, you look at shipping, you look at organized crime that you can track using space information. And it's actually that data piece. It's how do you process that data and how do you turn that into useful information for customers? So it's how the space industry itself can work with the data providers, the analysis, the potential use of AI and ML, and reach out to the customers to help them better understand. Because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are going to be putting the money into it. And if you can't make that relationship with those potential customers sustainable, it's just going to have a negative impact on industry.
Yeah, and I think so. Everything that you guys have been saying is really very much related to what you were saying at the beginning. All of the opportunities that space provides us with has to be really strongly highlighted for investors and for funding and governments to recognize, and it's fundamental that they do, because we really want to go beyond what we already have to tackle climate change, for example, as we were saying. As we were saying on how to track all of the environmental effects through from orbit. And so because one of the questions that is really very much like still a big question mark right now in the new space economy is that how can we stir the space economy towards creating new ways to battle climate change, but also limit the possible risks which may be caused by the expansion of the space economies, because a lot of the space activities that we have require a lot of sometimes not environmental friendly have not environmental friendly characteristics. So I was wondering what was your take on that?
I'll say it's going to get worse before it gets better, and by that I mean that launch is expected to sort of be a much more regular activity, which is not an environmentally friendly activity. However, the reason it happens so regularly is simply because of the amount of resources that are needed in space to actually operate. Once you start building out a system in space where the fancy word for it is in situ resource utilization. It just means recycling, and I don't know why they don't just say it. Means recycling satellites that already exist in space. All the components are there. It's an engineering challenge. It's not a scientific challenge to break those components down. Everything from the solar panels, everything to onboard electronics, the metal, the hardware, everything that makes up a satellite that's there. That's all there to be used. I'm going to get to my self-plug for MagDrive, and basically we use a metal propellant, and the benefit of that is that it exists in space. We're entirely agnostic as to the metal that we use. The advantage we see is that everybody else's propellant has to be brought from Earth, which is like building a new train every time you leave the station. You don't build railroads that way. The ideal thing to do is use the materials that already exist in space, whether it's in asteroids or whether it's in the satellites themselves. That creates a bit of a paradox as far as launch is concerned, because for customers operating in space, it represents a much more cost-effective way to operate. But launch is not in favor of that kind of approach. However, there are some encouraging signs. For example, it's not really a secret to anybody that launch is a loss leader. Now, every major launch company is doing something else, whether it's Starlink, Rocket Lab are doing much more with satellite platforms and small satellite deployment, and therefore you're going to see launch being sort of a boring topic eventually. And it's going to have to become much more targeted about what it launches and where, and it's going to be much more at the whims of companies which want to do these next steps. And it's going to be a key part, having that recycling, that will dictate exactly where that activity comes into play. So that recycling, the element of recycling, what we can recycle and to what degree, is going to be a really informative part of how the new space economy comes around. And it's becoming more recognized slowly, but it's very much led by the private sector in this. NASA have some technology demonstrations geared towards this, but NASA's take on technology demonstrations over the last 2 or 3 years is very much to take a backseat towards what the private industry is doing. The example that we talked about recently is Orbit Fab itself. Orbit Fab's capability is something that a government agency wouldn't have considered 5 years ago, let alone being feasible. And so it's willing, therefore, to take a backseat and enable it and take its lesson from that, which does mean that the question of money always comes back into it. NASA has the money, but it's waiting to take its lead, whereas a private company can just get things done a lot quicker. But it's exactly the direction we should be taking. Hopefully that wasn't too rambling. Usually people cut me off and they ask me to stop talking.
No, it was not rambling. No, because I think that by developing something, because sustainability means everything. It means to have something that is harnessed by all kinds of power in place, and that we can and environmental friendly, and that that is actually itself a launch for further developments. So it's the right direction. Like, I think on that side we're going on the right direction. But you were talking both before about the how we can move manufacturing of the planet, and that enters also in our climate change related conversation. And I was wondering, what kind of manufacturing that we have nowadays on Earth can be moved off the planet? And also, does that create any new opportunities for the industry if manufacturing moves to the environment where we have different laws of physics and gravity? And so, yeah, it's a big question, but...
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. Like, if you look at the history on Earth in terms of how the ability to take air out of a jar, what that led to. So vacuum pumps on Earth, what did that lead to? Well, it led to lots of products, including lamps, including lots of new processes, manufacturing processes and capabilities that literally drove the Industrial Revolution. So just imagine what would happen if you take gravity out of a jar, right? Not in the literal sense, but you know what I mean. And the kinds of transformative capabilities that might lead to over the next decades onwards. So you've got, really interesting companies like SpaceForge, who are actually developing capabilities around manufacturing in space, because when you don't have gravity or microgravity, you actually have more uniform kind of structures, more uniform creation of products, and you can create interesting new alloys. It's applicable for new drug creation and a whole host of other applications that we've yet to even discover. So I think we're really at the early stage of that, and it'll be an amazing kind of journey to follow. I'm certainly excited.
There's an element of auxiliary elements that come into that as well. So if you want to develop a single crystalline structure for, as we were saying, for drugs, for optics, for microchips, these facilities need protecting, mostly in the form of radiation shielding, which is an excellent place to start testing the things we'll eventually need for human beings in space as well. So none of this is just a one-off kind of capability. It feeds into a whole range of other companies, usually private companies, developing these capabilities, the strength of which is that it's a very horizontal industry. Once you've discovered an application or a capability, there's going to be a dozen other ways you can actually implement it as well.
And so I'm sure you are both very excited. We are all very excited for this to happen. But it's actually incredible how close to us the conversation that we're having is, and even though we're talking about gravity that is different from the one we have here, or laws of physics that we don't know, it's still something that is happening right now, and there are a lot of things that is happening in space and that we really are not really aware of. And one of the topics we're going to touch upon now is much more about how there are new forms of conflicts that emerge, because we talk about the environment and we talk about manufacturing. All of this engenders frictions for many stakeholders. Everyone has a say, and actually, space is a common good that is very difficult to manage and for everyone to agree upon. So, touching upon this, I was wondering if you could talk more about the new threats to the international community that the exploration of outer space territories entail, and also in this, how important do you think that global treaties and international administrations are in tackling those new forms of conflicts? Ali, we are waiting for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
You may have heard occasionally space being talked about as a sanctuary. The US like to talk about this a lot. It never has been. I think that's the first thing we have to stop thinking about space as being different. All right, it's still a domain, environment, whatever, of human activity, so it's really no different. People talk about the concerns about the militarization and the weaponization of space. Space has been militarized for decades, as soon as militaries started to realize it was useful. If you go back to the late 50s, I mean, the US Army was looking at, potential ways to interfere or destroy Soviet satellites. So this is not new. Space has been weaponized. The GPS is a military system, and was used, primarily. They talk about the first Gulf War as being the first space war because of the role it played. It's part of the kill chain. You talk about precision-guided munitions and all the information you give to militaries. It is militarized, it is weaponized. So we need to start understanding it kind of within that context and start thinking about it being, really, really different. Space essentially is about information. It's the information we get from it, whether that's Earth observation, whether it's, PNT, GPS data, comms, or, weather data. And as long as that information plays a role in defense, in national security, in national economics, it is going to be an area that is going to be contested. And as a result, we have seen the development of a whole range of what we call counter space capabilities. The Outer Space Treaty essentially says you can't place weapons of mass destruction in orbit, but of course that is 52, 53 years old, and it didn't understand, or there just wasn't the ability to really conceptualize what those capabilities would be in the future. So now we have kinetic anti-satellite missiles that have been tested. Again, China, Russia, everyone, they've tested against their own satellites. Huge problems with the creation of debris and space sustainability. We have the potential use of cyber attacks. We have the potential use of lasers that can dazzle the optics of a satellite and blind it. All these different ways that we can destroy or disrupt space systems. You're essentially just stopping someone from being able to use it. And that includes interference with the up and down links. So we see things like GPS jamming, and also against ground stations, which is why we don't use the term space weapon, because it doesn't really take into account the entire space system. The one thing that I think does make space a bit different, and I suppose gives a little bit of hope in terms of people being able to work together, is the nature of it, in that you can't really own space, you don't really own an orbit, and anything that you do in space can potentially impact every other user. So you could test, a missile against your own satellite and create huge amounts of debris. You don't know where that's going to go. It could impact your own satellite. And so there's this sort of fine balance of states in particular wanting to have the ability to act freely and potentially act against others while still being able to preserve the environment for future use. And I think then the other side that comes in is around the commercial actors who are growing faster in terms of numbers of satellites, but also in terms of capabilities. They're often, I made the point that the money that we see coming in from the private sector around things like reusable launch have changed that dynamic, and so you have this environment that also then you have the economics comes in, you have the private sector starting to play a role, and everyone's sort of trying to figure out how this is actually going to work in practice, and that we don't end up doing something really stupid, and kind of losing orbit. So that was a really long.
And this is being taken into account. I'm not saying we've solved the enforcement mechanism problem, which is probably the major issue, but at the UN, through ANUSA, through the Outer Space Organization there have been a number of attempts to resolve this sort of lack of updating the regulations since the Outer Space Treaty 50-some years ago. So you're really looking at issues like attribution. So how do we know when a nation state has attacked another satellite? It's very hard to do in space. Unless they launch an ASAT, there are a number of other ways that Ali's outlined that you can also take out somebody's space capability. And it's very difficult to discover who's liable for that. How do we manage space traffic management? So the LEO, whereas lower Earth orbit, whereas most of our space-based technologies are, is highly congested. And there are a lot of satellites there, and with all of the constellations about to be launched into space, there will be a lot more. So how do we negotiate space traffic management? How do we manage access into space? And how do we enhance the sort of regulatory regime and enforce the regulatory regime upon nations if not everyone agrees that we need to be involved, or that they need to pay attention to that? So these are issues that space law is trying to tackle, but of course, again, as Ali said, and space is a reflection of our political environment down here. So a lot of these discussions are being hampered by the Russian war in Ukraine, the China-US conflicts, and that unfortunately, I think the decision will be made for us at some point about the environment.
Yeah, I think just to start very quickly on the regulatory side. So they've tried for years through the Conference on Disarmament at the UN to kind of update the Outer Space Treaty in a way through something called PAROS, which is preventing an arms race in outer space, and it's something China and Russia led jointly on, and trying to get through something called the PPWT, which is the Prevention of the Placement of Weapons in Orbit Treaty. And that has basically stalled because, like you say, our politics on Earth is the same, so, they're trying to do that. The US will, say, you're being very hypocritical that you're trying to push this through, whilst at the same time you're testing your own capabilities. As an anecdote, I was at a session in Geneva of the Conference on Disarmament, and Venezuela had just taken over the presidency, so the US delegation walked out. So straight away, you end up, just being stalled. So what we're seeing now is actually UK-led initiative through the UN on norms of behaviour. So it's not looking specifically at capabilities, it's looking at the behaviour, and just to try and get some consensus on what does good behaviour look like. And so people will start to think, I want to be a trusted actor, but it also helps understand what the bad behaviour is and helps you to identify that. And I think, we've actually seen some traction now with the US coming out and saying we're going to have a ban on the testing of kinetic anti-satellite missiles, and that a lot of countries have joined in on. I mean, even 5 years ago, that was almost just unheard of. We didn't expect that to happen. So things are slowly getting there, but it's going to take a while.
And just to kind of lead on from what Ali was saying earlier as well, where space is inherently dual use in nature, and you go back to the development of the V2 rocket. Wernher von Braun, who also designed the Apollo moon rocket, he said that V2 was the right rocket; it just landed on the wrong planet. So at the end of the day, it is what you do with that technology that leads to a lot of conflict and again, having those norms of behavior. There are some who say maybe looking at the law of seas, and is it the laws of seas? Law of seas. But like other kind of similar legislation on Earth that can draw parallels to how we do kind of progress with some of the regulation and being able to avoid future conflicts. I think that's quite important.
Yeah, it is profoundly dual use, and it is also right now, as we said before, being used also by many more stakeholders, and it's multiplying because we are getting there with the technology, and the norms have to follow what the development of the technology as well, and we already have a lot of issues doing that on Earth, so with something as space that we can't really conceptualize philosophically, it's been a challenge. And so I was wondering for all of you, if you had any suggestion on how outer space norms and how the public and the private sector can work most efficiently in order to ensure the peaceful use of outer space. What are the norms that are where there are the most synergies between the two sectors, and where it's important that the two sectors work together?
I'd say, first of all, the commercial sector has to play a really big role. I think, for too long it's been states who have these conversations. But the commercial sector has a huge amount of technical capability. They're at the forefront of developments. They have as much at stake as states do in space. They are huge actors. Often, we often talk about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 space powers, and actually, you could easily put some commercial companies within that in terms of their own capabilities. Having them involved in that conversation, I think is important, particularly because commercial actors can also be at risk from hostile acts. We have seen that happen through the Ukraine conflict. It is dual use. You can't always distinguish between this is a military capability, this is a civilian capability. Some companies, will provide information to militaries, and as they can be threatened. I think the other point I'd make is that all the treaties have been trying to be too big. We need to prevent the weaponization of space. We need to keep space safe. Let's just try and get something small done and get some agreement on it to show that we can do it. So one potential area would be around rendezvous proximity operations. So spacecraft being able to approach another spacecraft. We see that with potential satellite servicing, debris removal, manufacturing, but we also see it potentially in a security context with satellites that, if you can fix a satellite, you can break it. And satellites approaching other ones. If you can create some sort of norm around, unless there is prior notification that some sort of activity is going to take place and this spacecraft is going to approach this spacecraft, that they've broken the norm, and then there's some sort of way of being able to respond to that. But we need to get some trust built between every single space actor, whether they're states or whether they're commercial.
If I can ask you something then, not to do your job for you, is something like the Artemis Accords then a good jumping off point for those normalized standards of behavior for security cooperation?
I think they have a role to play within it. I don't think there's one route for it, but all the initiatives that we're seeing, whether it's the Artemis Accords, whether it's the conversations at the UN, whether it's through other aspects of the UN that have been doing space policy, whether it's through bilateral agreements, there's lots of ways we can do this, and I think we don't know which one's going to work right yet, so we need to just kind of keep plugging away at all of them.
Any other suggestion for norms that we can work on? Nothing?
I'd just add very quickly on the aspect of the commercial side there, only because it's an aspect of the commercial side of the industry which it decides on its own standards. So two commercial space companies who work together will decide on what their own technical engineering standards are, and they'll go from there. If you are a commercial company that works with a space agency, then you better have a team of about 20 people to cut through all the goddamn red tape they have, or you better be ready to do 100-hour weeks just by yourself. So there's a real incentive for commercial companies to work with each other and to leave agencies alone and away. It's a little bit different in the US, maybe, just because of the kind of the benefits, like we've already described, the benefits that working with NASA or the DoD or the US government brings. Our own personal experience with the European Space Agency, it's anecdotal, sure, but my God, it's almost horrifying. I'm still waiting on a conversation for a grant application that I had confirmed in November 2019. It takes a lot, and like I said, it incentivizes commercial companies to work together. And therefore, there's a framework already there where commercial companies will decide on what the minimum amount of cooperation and strategy, and I hate to use the word synergy, is, and that's it. And they'll decide it for themselves, and what it's created is a baseline across the industry of how commercial companies work together. So there's another element there around normative behavior, which is based entirely on mutual self-interest between all the parties involved, which is another way the commercial space will kind of lead the conversation, like you were saying.
Yeah, we see that, I think, with the Space Data Association. So, commercial companies who can speak to each other. And one of those areas is around potential conjunctions. So, they will get warning, your satellite might potentially collide with another one. And again, anecdotally, we've heard that companies are having to Google the phone numbers of other companies to try and call them to say, our satellites might collide. We need to try and figure out what to do. ESA was trying to email SpaceX for like a week to say, something might happen here. So again, at least having a way that, can we talk to each other and then maybe think about what we're going to do? Questions, bigger questions about who's going to move and how good the data is, but at least, having some contact details would help.
It's really hard to get in touch with Starlink. They don't care.
Yeah.
They don't care at all. They've got volume. So you can call them, someone might pick up, and as soon as you tell them it's about a conjunction, they put the phone down. Great.
We've got 56,000 other satellites.
Yeah, we don't care.
And there's another kind of body, self-organized somewhat, with some support from DARPA called Confers, which is around making sure there's standards among different capabilities and things like rendezvous, proxops, and docking, as well as other areas. So there's that kind of self-organizing ability. You also have the ITU when it comes to telecoms regulation, and that's a really important kind of part of the space puzzle, shall we say. And so I think it's in the commercial industries and the space industries' interest to ensure that sustainable orbital environment, because without it, they wouldn't have a business, right? So very much it's just about aligning, making sure we're all on the same page and working accordingly with government and industry, making it all work together is important.
Yeah, communication is key. I think every time that we stumble upon a problem in space, it's always also a problem on the ground, on Earth as well. So I think basically, space actually highlights all of the characteristics that we display as humans, and that's why also it's very difficult to face the limitless opportunities that it offers, because it also offers opportunities to face actually who we are as a species. And so on that note, I just wanted to conclude our conversation before taking any questions. So we are we are seeing a lot of developments in the technology on how to move to other planets, and we are in a big momentum on this, and so we are actually considering moving to other planet, but somehow, as we saw right now, all of our socioeconomical models are still stagnating on a lot of issues, and so this stagnating situation, this socioeconomic stagnating situation, how do you think that, what are the challenges that this will pose when we settle on a new planet, and then we will face who we are as the human species, and do you think our existing models of social and political, like social and political systems, are adequate for such exploration?
I think that's a hard one to say yes to, but I was thinking about this question because we received it ahead of time, and on the train in today, I was listening to utopian literature because there's a lot of really interesting sort of scientific utopian literature from the 70s and the 80s as the space race started to really gain momentum. And there was all of these sort of ideals about, you know, we can create this new sort of society on Mars or the moon or something like that. And I was sort of listening to a really interesting podcast about it, and they were talking about how utopian literature is all based around a very limited section of society. And I think, you know, the space community really spends a lot of time together, and we are very much, you know, focused on these sort of utopian ideals of science, and we can learn all of these new things, and we can solve all of these problems if people would just listen to us. And I think space held this sort of idealistic kind of utopian vision of a future. And I think as you're hearing through the discussion today, inevitably political and commercial systems here on Earth creep into those utopian visions. And so I don't think, sadly, that we'll be able to develop a new kind of socio-political ideal system, because unfortunately we are still human beings who will create the systems we have here on Earth.
In particular, moving to another planet enables us to carry the same political structures with us, which are in ideal. The area where I see a lot of friction coming from is the question of control and distance. Human beings are not very good still at controlling other human beings across a massive distance. We're not very good at doing it locally either. Like, a huge number of countries have come into existence in the last 20 years, for example. And when you're on a 2D plane, regardless of the fact that it's actually a sphere, any kind of enclave can, in the worst case scenario, basically be surrounded or brought to do what the controlling body, or let's call it hegemony, wants it to do. And this is going to become a situation we're going to see as we put more and more people on Mars or on the moon. They're going to get their own ideas about what they want to do, how they want to run their societies, but they're going to be ultimately dictated to by people who don't live there, who have very deep commercial, financial interests in what goes on there. The better idea that I see is actually we should be living in space instead. Not just from the point of view that Martian gravity sucks, it's 38% of Earth's gravity. Good luck having a long lifetime there. Good luck having a baby on Mars. No one ever talks about this. They want to put humans live on Mars. You can't have children on Mars. You just can't. Or God bless the ones that will come out, because they'll need it. So instead, we should just live in orbital habitats, and we can spin up the gravity to do this, and that's it. That's great. The added benefit here is that in space, you cannot surround an enclave that exists in 3 dimensions. You can't. It can just go off in any direction it wants, especially if it has really good propulsion. So the key there is to expect civil disobedience, to enable it, and to maximize it for maximum return on what space can do for our entire species. Because the more diffuse that political control is, the more widespread the benefits of space will be. The last thing you want is a company town next to another company town, all owned by Musk or Bezos, those kind of people. That doesn't give any kind of real return about what space can do for our entire species to the maximum number of people across the maximum number of countries on Earth. If you have an orbital habitat, the progressive breakaway faction only needs to win once to actually create an entirely new way of working with itself, but also its relation to other orbital habitats and the way they interact with each other as well. So, yeah, forget about Mars, forget putting up people on Mars. Mars is a great place to mine and to extract resources for research, but people, human beings, we stand the best chance of having a good future in space if we live in space. Shouldn't see space as some kind of ocean to cross to another shore. Space itself is a fantastic place to live and a fantastic place to build. especially because you can just create the gravity you want.
Sounds like you've already been there.
Not physically, but
And I would agree with all that. Space is hard. I think, you know, we see really cool things happen, and we see reusable rockets and all this stuff going on. It's really hard. And, you know, this idea that, you know, people are talking about, oh, we're going to have asteroid mining, and this is so far in the future before it actually starts to really work. So, and the question of whether our political system will work, I mean, who knows what the political system is going to look like in 100 years, 200 years, whenever we can realistically do all this. Second point, the Outer Space Treaty does prevent, you know, to say you can't claim a celestial body. So someone can land an asteroid to mine it, and someone else can literally land right next to you, and there's pretty much nothing you can do about it. I'm just really cynical. I just think that actually, you know, humans are humans, and we'll probably find a way to screw it up. So we'll just try and do the fun things and put telescopes up there and learn what we can. But yeah, I really don't have high hopes that we're going to be able to find a different way to live in space that doesn't just bring out the worst in humanity.
I'm going to be somewhat contrarian here, and kind of, when we look at the United States, right, they kind of became the beacon of liberty and freedom around the world, right? So there's flaws in that, yes, but in terms of an idealistic kind of society that stemmed from what was then, you know, there's a lot of bad stuff that went down with it, but I'm trying to take the good and the bad together. So in a similar way, maybe there's a potential society that comes out with a more idealistic views and more idealistic approach to humanity. Maybe they'll bring some flaws too, but I think there's a progression in the future of humanity. If you look at just the arc of history, there's generally a progression, and I'm generally somewhat more idealistic, but yeah, that's
anything that gives us the room to experiment in that way.
Yeah.
Anything that enables humanity to try out different political ideas, societal, structural ideas, anything like that, that's a good thing. That would be a good thing.
It's a beautiful way to end.
It is a beautiful way to end. The good, the bad, and the ugly, and then here we are. I mean, thank you so much for all of this. And so I think that on that very wide note, we really want to welcome questions. We have 15 minutes for this. So, yes, sir.
I want to ask about a possible application of space technology, which is space-based solar power, which has got collectors in space that can catch large amounts of solar energy and then beam it to the ground. It was written about by Isaac Asimov in the 1940s. It seems that there are challenges, but the British government, at least last year, did have a report on its website saying that if they put their minds to it, there could be a demonstration in place by 2031 and commercially significant quantities of energy from space by 2042. It seems to me that's a much more honourable, much more profound goal than putting humans to walk on Mars. It could be a connection to the last panel. You know, it could be a tremendously huge source of clean energy. So my question for the panel is, do you think there's any chance that that will be achieved by 2042?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it's happening. It was called the Space Energy Initiative.
Space-based
Yeah.
energy.
And it's now spun out into
Space Solar Limited. So the company I work for is actually the company that did that techno-economic assessment for BEIS. It's never really been a problem of science. It's been a problem mostly of cost, and one of I think the key driver of that is the decrease in launch cost to actually get everything up there. There are still a lot of work to do in terms of proving the power transmission over the distances, the ability to assemble these structures in space, and obviously then some political questions, you know, particularly around, well, this is going to be a strategic energy asset in space, so there's some protection there. But yeah, the UK is moving forward very quickly. Space Solar Limited is now, you know, for funding to actually start to get demonstrators, you know, working, you know, within a decade, and looking out to 2040 to actually have something out there that is providing energy. The assessment shows that the levelized cost of electricity is incredibly competitive. So it could play a really big role. We're seeing it happen in other countries. The US is starting to look at it. ESA has the Solaris program and is starting to do some work to look at the feasibility. China is doing that. As I said, it's not really a question of the science is there. It's an engineering question and a financing question. But I absolutely believe that if we get the program right, and we get the plan in place and we have the funding, that we can absolutely see that becoming a reality by those states.
One challenge maybe is if you've got a single asset which is kilometers wide and it's going to take time to build that, but also from a kind of defense perspective, that is a potential target, right? So yeah. I do wonder about those implications as well.
Yeah, so I think looking at it, so one of the designs being looked at is very modular. So it's quite resilient, to be resilient to certain types of threat. But I think looking at it as it's not replacing anything. It's just it is a contribution to net zero. So it's not like you lose the space-based solar power satellite and we're all gonna not have any power. But absolutely, I think looking and understanding what politically and security-wise a number of these structures, but from different countries in orbit, is actually going to mean for that sort of management of geostationary orbit and ensuring that, and I guess looking at it not necessarily in a national context, but seeing it as something that is beneficial to humanity, and if you kind of put it in that way, it potentially makes it a less attractive target, maybe.
Thank you. No other question? Yes.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the panelists for providing some insightful arguments into space economy and beyond, alongside the perspectives from defense and military-related studies. I'm Ivan. I'm Ivan Krompis. I'm a UCL graduate in international public policy. I'd like to ask about the implications of rivalries, geopolitical rivalries, and outer space today. Are we going to see a space race that is even worse than the Cold War, for example? Because now the geopolitical rivalry is not just between the US and Russia, but also US and China. So they are facing two very big big actors in international relations. And the second question to ask is about how will governments and markets, if I can say, address the role of malign bad actors and the space economy in outer space. Thank you.
Michelle, do you want to start?
Yes, it is a major concern, of course, and I think this is one of the reasons why we're working in the international regulatory diplomacy spectre, because both yes, there is a Cold War occurring from a technological perspective between China and the US, but of course any sort of kinetic attack or even non-kinetic attack indicates threats for both China and the US. So it is in both of their interests to be good actors and behave well in space. And it's just trying to communicate that in a sort of codified language through the international regulations at INUSA that we're working on. And as the gentleman mentioned before, the commercial sector is really leading the way in developing these norms because of the political vacuum internationally. Commercial companies are obliged to develop norms between each other, to develop these sort of regimes that now the international state actors are obliged to follow. So hopefully that's some sort of realm for optimism.
I mean, I think that a lot of talk is given to kinetic anti-satellite missiles because you can see it. Everyone gets really upset about it, and there's lots of international condemnation, and then people worry about the debris. But I think what we're seeing in space is exactly what's happening everywhere else. Most of the conflict that's happening is sub-threshold, right? So it's whatever term you want to use, a so-called grey zone or hybrid warfare. So it's going to be these non-kinetic attacks. So it's cyber, it's disruption. GPS jamming goes on all the time. That's a counter space capability, and everyone just sort of accepts that it happens. So I think for me that's really where we're going to see it going, and I think there is an understanding amongst the major powers. No one is going to be able to dominate space. That this idea of being the absolute, supreme power in space is just not going to happen. It's just about finding, for each actor, if you're looking at it from a military point of view, it's I want to be able to ensure my access to space and make sure that I've got all those capabilities, and I want to be able to disrupt my adversaries if I can, in a way that hopefully doesn't create sort of long-lasting damage, in the space environment. But for me personally, the idea that conflicts are going to start with people shooting each other's satellites is just not going to happen.
Thank you. Any other question? Yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to go back very briefly to the idea of sort of TL123 space powers, and sort of just ask really, in the sort of foreseeable future, maybe the midterm, how much of what goes on in space, particularly the regulation of who is working there, will sort of become dominated by larger powers, or how much they're going to proliferate down to a term you might say regional powers? I know those are quite loaded terms to say what is a great power. If you compare sort of negotiations where all countries with stakes on international issues are involved, to just those, say, on nuclear weapons, where it's only sort of a very select number that actually have the technical capability. I was wondering if you could comment from the technical perspective as to how much of this technology is going to become available to sort of middle powers and regional powers, and what effect that might have on how easy or difficult it is to actually regulate it.
I think what you'll see here is that a lot of smaller players, or smaller powers if you like, who are essentially late to the space race or new space age just because they're not the US, for example, or the West or Europe, they're going to develop very niche space capabilities based around existing strengths, whether it's mineral or mining extraction, or some subsection even of astronaut health monitoring, who knows. And I think current Earth geopolitics, such as alliances, whether they're economic or political, will play a role as to where they get pulled into different areas of work. But I think that's going to be a really key part of how those smaller players get involved. For example, developing a launch capability from nowhere doesn't really service your small country in that same way that being a world leader in a subsection of, say, space automation or automatic inspection, for example, might, because that's a really key technology that even the really big space players would much rather, bring you into the fold to work with you on, rather than developing it themselves. And it does also, I suppose, this isn't my area, but it seems like it would strengthen a political tie on Earth as well as in space.
I think everyone has something that they get from space. So even if you're not a space actor, essentially you could be a state that doesn't have any space assets, but you are reliant on space. Space is important to you. So it doesn't matter how many satellites you have, how big your space industry is. You have a role to play in that. So I think that all states want to be involved, have something to say, and should be at the table. Alliances are very important. I think whether it's Five Eyes or NATO, I think soft power is playing a big role. If you look at what China's doing with Beidou, which is their version of GPS, getting other countries involved, they've done a huge amount in South America in terms of investment in space. So they've been helping to build and launch satellites. They have a radar station, I think, in Argentina that is apparently civilian, but no one really knows. And also when we, I've been in some of these discussions talking about norms of behavior and responsible behavior in space and how we can protect it. And organizations like the Red Cross are involved, so humanitarian organizations, because they understand the role that space plays in our everyday lives and how the loss of it could have serious humanitarian implications. So we talk about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 space powers in terms of their capabilities, so whether they have launch, big military space industries, whether they're involved in exploration. But I think when we look at norms of behavior, everyone is involved, and actually because of the geopolitical rivalries and the stagnation that we have in some of those UN bodies with the US, Russia and China, it's actually the smaller countries who can get things moving faster. So the UK leading on these discussions rather than the US has probably seen a huge amount more traction. So actually, we should have Indonesia and Brazil and Mexico and I don't know, Bulgaria and whoever else wants to get involved, but they should be playing a big role in this because it does affect everyone, and we need to not look at space so much in terms of those tiers when it comes to how we manage it going forward.
Yeah, just kind of extending on that with maybe an example of Rwanda, where a US-based commercial company, eSpace I think it's called, have a license for 300,000 satellites through the Rwandan Space Agency, I believe. So there's that kind of spreading of like opportunities, but also challenges when it comes to different nations and the kinds of things that they get involved in. So things like jurisdiction shopping, that's tending to happen as well. So yeah, there's a bit of a bifurcation of the tiers, so to speak.
Yes, thank you so much. Any other last questions for the panel? No, nothing. Well, then, in that case, really give a huge round of applause for our wonderful panelists.
Thank you, everyone. And can we give a round of applause for Melusine as well for navigating quite a difficult and technical panel. And in addition, I'd also like to say a personal thanks to Michelle, who recruited 2 other panelists for what would otherwise be a space panel of 2. So very much thank you to you as well, Michelle. I think that's our program for the 2 days, guys. Apart from, we've still got the VR and Tech Expo running today as well. I wanted to end by just saying thank you to all of you, those of you who attended today, those of you who have been here for the entire program. Honestly, personally speaking, this has turned out, 10 times better than I could have ever imagined. And it's a testament to the entire team and also to you. I think I've been really pleasantly surprised / blown away by how engaged you as audience members have been. Some really tough technical questions and really, really engaging with the source material in a way that I honestly wasn't when I was an LSE student, so big contrast there. And I also just wanted to say, there's been a lot of people behind the scenes who have really helped to get the show off the ground and to keep it running accordingly. And I'd like to just call out one in particular who's gone above and beyond throughout this entire process, and that's Will Stein. Will, do you want to stand up? So basically, I probably should have said what Will does before I asked you to clap for him, but you probably want to clap even more. So the entire food fair, the entire food stall has been sourced and run by Will. He reached out to all the food and beverage suppliers. He managed to get us very competitive quotes, managed to bring everything in under budget. And if you were benefiting from the seamless kind of I don't know what you'd call it, Will, conveyor belt. That's all Will's design. He's been an absolute magician in kind of bringing that together, and as a result, he's not been able to enjoy most of the panels, most of the VR experience, and he's just been an absolute dream in kind of bringing this summit together. It wouldn't be the same without you, Will, so really please extend a huge round of applause to Will. And I think with that, I will just end on the note by saying we will be reaching out with an email, hopefully with recordings attached of all the panels. I think we've still got to vet them to make sure that everything has been recorded, etc. There'll also be an invite for all of you guys to engage with us online and as a community. We'd like to build this as an annual event going forward with initiatives surrounding the same. I think the final thing to say is I curated a lot of the content around the panels. I kind of wanted to give everyone a very varied diet, looking at a lot of these themes from a high-level perspective, but also allowing us, enough meat on the bones for the experts and professionals in the field to engage with these topic areas. And I think we've by and large succeeded with that. But I have to be completely honest with you. Some of the content, some of the connections that have been made between the different topic areas, or even things that I didn't anticipate. So I think we're all going to be students of uncertainty going forward. And I invite you to, both engage with these topics through our media and otherwise. It's been an absolute delight. Thank you very much. And just to end with, we're now ready to receive you in like the VR and the Tech Expo. But, otherwise have a wonderful weekend and, thanks again.